This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 33 of World to Win. This is the second part of our two-parter episodes for International Women's Day. So before we start, please just don't forget to subscribe to our channel, click the bell button to be notified when we go live, and also like and share this video. And obviously comment on this video as well. We want to hear from you as much as possible, and it also really helps us to reach as many more people as possible. So on part one of this episode, that you can find very easily on our channel, we've discussed the history of International Women's Day and its connections to the workers' movement and why it's so important for socialists to be involved in the fight for women and for women's rights, and how our movement has been involved in them since the beginning of that movement. And we think history is incredibly important. I think it teaches us so much, but this time we're going to talk about today and the way that the women's movement is going, what it needs to achieve, and also how to do it. So really important episode ahead of us. Our lineup today, really incredible. We are going to talk about the situation for women under COVID. We also have a really inspiring interview with socialist feminist activists from Mexico, who will talk about the movement against femicide and gender violence there. So really interesting, really looking forward to hear about that. And also we're gonna talk about the new wave of struggle that's engulfing the entire world right now with the kind of new wave of Me Too. But before we start, I wanna ask you a little question. Where are you based? Have you been involved in any feminist struggles this year? Have you ever been involved in any feminist struggles in the past few years? What was the most memorable protest that you've been to in the last couple of years to do with the women's struggle? Can't wait to hear. I always love looking through these comments and seeing what people from all around the world have been doing in their own respective countries, so please comment. So while you go and do that, I want to say hi to my co-host. So Toya, how are you doing?
How's it going, Yara? It's good to see you again. So last week, we talked about the historical significance of International Women's Day. We had speakers on talking about, struggles in the early 1900s and how we came to celebrate this very important day. But today, we're going to talk a little bit more about the current struggle and how especially women workers under this COVID pandemic are being affected. Women workers oftentimes are essential workers, which is a term that we've come to learn truly what essential workers are. They're not the CEOs, they're not the bankers, they're the nurses, they're the healthcare aides, they're the teachers, they're the mothers. And so today we have Marty with us. She is a member of Socialist Alternative in the US, and she's president of her nurses union in Philly. So welcome, Marty.
Hey there, Toya. I'm actually vice president, but other than that,
excuse me.
Got it just right.
Okay, perfect. I wanted to start today talking, Marty, because actually almost a year ago, I remember being on a panel with you at the beginning of COVID, and you were speaking about what it was like as a nurse and, the effects of the disease and your experiences. So maybe if you could, think about the past year, where are we at today in the situation for essential workers in the crisis?
I think the short answer is exhausted. We are physically, emotionally, psychologically exhausted from the increased stress at work and that increased stress at home as parents and partners, like everybody else is struggling with. At the outset of the pandemic, a lot of people were calling us heroes. And I think what they actually meant was martyrs, right? We were being forced to work in unsafe conditions without the adequate protection, even when our employers knew exactly what we needed to keep ourselves safe. They knew what the risks were. And this has led to a shift in somehow essential workers are thinking about their jobs and about their employers. The idea that we're all on the same side, that we're working towards a common goal, or that they have, that ultimately, you know, our managers have our backs. This has suffered, that idea has suffered a really serious, maybe even a mortal blow. So 1 year in, we are still struggling with some of the same issues with staffing, equipment, supplies, appropriate personal protective equipment that we need to do our jobs well and to provide the high quality service that we're trained to provide and that we took these jobs to provide. I think that's what people forget sometimes, is that we took these jobs because we wanted to do this work. Our jobs are always hard, but they can also be extremely rewarding. And the pandemic has robbed us of so many of the rewards. Healthcare workers are seeing patient after patient leave in body bags rather than walking out, you know, with their families back to being themselves again, you know. Educators are watching children fall behind or worrying about the ones that aren't showing up. Even retail and hospitality workers who've experienced like massive job loss and income loss and super high turnover rates. Anyone dependent on tips is really struggling. They have to go to work, but there aren't enough customers when they get there to like bring home a living wage, and they're worrying about each other. Where are their friends that they haven't seen? So a year on, I think a lot of essential workers are reevaluating. They're kind of in the process of thinking about their work in new ways, about who really needs who. Like you were saying, do the employers need us more than we need them? Or is it the other way around? About the need for us to have more control in our workplaces beyond just wages and benefits, right? But control over work rules, over job assignments, over staffing levels, even over supply chains and the layout of the workplace to actually keep us safe. So I think there are openings here for us as socialists to engage with our coworkers in really important discussions about the nature of work within this profit-driven capitalist system, and very concretely how it can be different with a strong union that has strong leadership, and ultimately how it could be different in a different system under socialism.
I definitely want to dive into what you just ended with there about how workers can fight back. I mean, especially in regards to women workers, essential workers. You mentioned healthcare and education. And as you said, these are two industries that people go into this work because they want to, because they're passionate, because they care. And the bosses use that passion and use the fact that they are caring for other humans against them as a way to stop them from organizing. So I'm wondering if you can go a little bit more in depth about how can healthcare workers and education workers alike use their very unique position to fight beyond wages and fight beyond working conditions, which of course are extremely important, especially in a pandemic, to win victories for the whole society.
Yeah, so we're sort of in a unique position in some ways. It's a very strong position in terms of connections with our patients and our students and families. In other ways, we're in a much weaker position than other workers in the capitalist economy because, you know, we're not generally bringing in tons of profits for the capitalists. So there's some similarities and some differences with other workers and the struggles, their own struggles in their workplaces. Even pre-pandemic and obviously taking on added urgency during the pandemic, healthcare and education workers around the world had been demonstrating what looked like a new way to fight and win, but really was a return to traditional methods and ideas that built the labor movement as part of the working class movement like 150 years ago, right? And that by linking up with other working class people outside of our immediate workplaces and engaging them in a united fight around demands that benefited everyone. And in our case, of course, for high quality, fully funded services like education and healthcare. And of course, that fight looked a little different from country to country. depending on how the services were traditionally supplied and funded, whether it was a public system or a private system or a mix of the two. But they shared a lot of common features and built around slogans like safe staffing saves lives in education, or our working conditions are our students' learning conditions in healthcare. They really highlighted how straight the line of solidarity is from healthcare workers to their patients, or from educators to their students and families. But this also means, as you mentioned, that that's a really powerful weapon against us, because our most powerful weapon or tool in the fight against the bosses, the strike, has an immediate and powerfully negative impact on our patients and our students. So people are always not necessarily afraid to pull that trigger, but they're going to think very seriously about it. They're not going to just strike on a whim or over a few cents on their wages, right? This has to be a real fight for the service that we provide and for the quality of that service. So it's super important that we communicate that our work stoppage is necessary to prevent much greater harm later that we won't be able to stop, and that we've already tried every other method available to us. And it comes down to this. This is where we draw our line, and this is where we fight. This is a fight for our patients or for our students, not against them, right? And we need to bring working class people into those fights. And to be able to do that, we need to organize them a little bit differently. So we have, the recent successful strikes by both educators and healthcare workers have combined kind of big, energetic picket lines at the work sites with rallies in downtown central locations at lunchtime or in the evening, so that working class people can come either, on their break or after work in large numbers and demonstrate to, the funders, the governments, whether it's your city council or your state government, that there's real support behind this struggle, that this is something that all working class people are willing to come out for and fight for. And in the midst of the pandemic lockdowns, the fight back by healthcare workers in Belgium, you might have seen that video, where they turned their backs on the prime minister. That was part of a fight that effectively helped restore millions of euros back that had been cut in their public health system. And we don't want this to be like our little secret for how we win strikes or how we win full funding for healthcare or for education, right? We want these methods to be taken up by workers in sectors that are much more strategic in the capitalist economy and apply them in their struggles, not only because they'd win, which they would, of course, but because it would advance the larger struggle that we're in to reset the focus of the organized labor movement from the wages and conditions of, just that small slice of the workforce that they're looking at, their membership, to their traditional, the way they saw their jobs as fighting for the working class as a whole, in a time when the socialist movement and the labor movement were one movement, not two separate movements that weren't talking to each other. We're trying to bring this politics of class struggle, of fighting for the whole working class, back into these struggles. And education and healthcare struggles have that little opening where we can show how this is really effective and really the right thing to do, and hopefully other unions will take it up.
Yeah, I really like how you ended there talking about how we can, bring in the whole working class. I mean, when I think of educators and nurses and struggle, it's those two slogans that you mentioned, when fully funded education, is it's a better working condition for the teachers, but it also affects the students. And safe staffing, it's a better working condition for the nurses, but it also affects the patients. And so it's these demands that, I know you said that in the beginning of the pandemic, nurses were called heroes, and you talked about that. But I mean, it's true. The nurses and the educators are fighting for the people that they are helping, for the students, for the patients, and it's really inspiring. And it shows that struggle, can be united across the working class, because when my conditions are better, your conditions are better, and I think that's really important. Linking those two aspects. And I mean, when a few years ago in the U.S., when the West Virginia teachers went on strike, one of the main demands that they were fighting for was fully funded education, of course, along with healthcare and higher wages. But that in 2018, when those teachers went on strike, it really kicked off the labor movement. And you yourself, Marty, I know you are you've been on the picket line. I know, and you've gone on strike before. But is this what we're going to have to keep doing? Are we just going to have to keep fighting these defensive battles, going on strike, trying to win a little more? How can we get out of this kind of revolving door of cuts and attacks?
Well, I guess at the risk of sounding a little bit snarky, capitalism by definition, Toya, is a system that produces goods and services that can be sold at a profit, right? And the reverse is also true, that only those goods and services which can be sold at a profit are produced. And education and healthcare for the working class, even though we're the vast majority in society, doesn't really create sufficient profits to get those services on the capitalist to-do list, right? Unless or until we make it so. And it was only those powerful movements of the mass working class from earlier generations that ever forced governments to divert even that little portion of the profits, of the capitalist profits that they did, to funding public goods like education and healthcare, childcare, even workplace safety, environmental regulation. Even though we all breathe the same air, I guess they think they'll have special air. I don't know, really. But in these moments, when the working class the movements have ebbed, or especially during times of crisis like the current situation we're in, the capitalists have moved aggressively on to the offensive, like you said, to take back what they consider is theirs. And they've lowered taxes for the wealthy and the corporations, which then means that governments have to cut budgets on public programs, even when they're absolutely essential, like healthcare and education. But budget cuts are just like beginner level takebacks, and we've experienced over the last 50 years how public programs have been divided between those that can be sold for a profit in the market, and those ones have been privatized, and the public services which can't be sold for a profit in the marketplace. And those services have been returned to families, most often to be provided for free by already overburdened women who are essential workers in their paid part of their day. And then they come home and they have this second shift that they do, taking care of family members, either elderly or young family members. But so as Marxists, we're actively engaged in every defensive struggle, right, that comes before us to prevent further erosion of those services, to restore budget cuts, to stop school closures, and every offensive struggle to win new gains like new organizing drives. I'm so excited about Amazon in Bessemer, Alabama. I can't wait to see what happens there. And every other non-union workplace, those are offensive gains when we make inroads into new areas. But here in the U.S., it would be things like winning the things from Bernie's program, Medicare for All, which would be public payment for private health care, but still would be a huge step forward. But like you said a revolving door. I always call it the game of cat and mouse, where the labor movement, takes one step forward and two steps back until we can make a fundamental break with the system of capitalism. And working people, the vast majority in society, are making democratic decisions. We're setting the priorities about how society's vast resources are deployed. And so those super profitable corporations are taken into public control and ownership, and then we use those resources to provide education, healthcare, clean air, all the things that working class people need to live a good life.
Well, you give us hope, Marty. Thank you. I love ending our segments on a positive note because there's just so much turmoil, especially when we're talking about something, so devastating as the pandemic. So I want to thank you for coming on our show, and hopefully we'll have you on again real soon.
Thanks. It was nice talking to you, Toya. Take it easy.
And now we have a special segment from one of our members in Mexico to talk about the women's struggles there.
Actualmente en México vivimos una crisis económica, política, social y de salud sumamente grave, parte de ello provocado por la pandemia de COVID-19, misma que ha exacerbado problemáticas surgidas hace ya décadas. Bajo este panorama, las mujeres somos el sector más afectado en términos de violencia estructural, tanto en el ámbito doméstico como público y económico. Acorde con el Alto Comisionado de las Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos en México, ocurren entre 7 a 10.5 feminicidios al día, y al menos 51.4% de los casos quedan en completa impunidad, lo que significa que poco menos de un feminicidio en México es castigado. La mayoría de las veces, la violencia ejercida contra las mujeres proviene de personas cercanas. 44% de las mexicanas reportaron haber sufrido violencia por parte de su esposo o pareja. En ese sentido, bajo el contexto de la pandemia, la necesidad de quedarse en casa ha figurado como caldo de cultivo para el incremento de la violencia doméstica e intrafamiliar contra mujeres y niñas. Esto ha sufrido un aumento del 60% en todo el país. Asimismo, la violencia no solo se queda en el abuso físico y mental del ámbito doméstico, también abarca términos laborales y económicos. En nuestro país, así como en muchos otros, las mujeres han asumido el papel histórico impuesto de llevar a cabo todo el trabajo de cuidados, lo cual, al ser combinado con el trabajo asalariado, se traduce en una mayor carga que ha incrementado a raíz de la pandemia, ya que, al haberse imposibilitado el acceso de las y los niños a guarderías y escuelas, se produjo un aumento de responsabilidades que suelen recaer en su mayoría sobre las mujeres.
Por otro lado, el hecho de que las mujeres hemos sido excluidas estructuralmente del contexto laboral asalariado se recrudece en la pandemia. Las mujeres suelen ganar menos que los hombres en términos salariales. De acuerdo con la OCDE, la brecha salarial de género en México es de 18.8%, una de las brechas más altas respecto del 13% promedio mundial. Además, suelen tener menos acceso a puestos de trabajo de alta dirección y sufrir mayor discriminación. Bajo dicho contexto, muchas mujeres han intentado superar su situación de precariedad laboral a partir de emprendimientos de la venta de artículos variados a través de redes sociales y redes en su comunidad. A estas mujeres se les suele calificar con nombres despectivos como nenis, desde una visión patriarcal en donde la imagen de la mujer independiente y trabajadora es completamente negativa. Todo lo anterior tiene lugar gracias a un contexto de ignorancia y despotismo de los grandes gobernantes sobre la situación de violencia y discriminación estructural que vivimos las mujeres en México, desde el presidente hasta los funcionarios con cargos públicos e incluso aspirantes a gubernaturas como Félix Salgado Macedonio, quien fue denunciado por cometer violación y maltrato físico a una de sus empleadas en repetidas ocasiones, así como los abusos de la policía y el poder judicial. Reproducen discursos patriarcales y conductas que atentan en contra de nuestra integridad. Por otro lado, en épocas electorales surge el oportunismo de sectores de derecha que se montan sobre la lucha de las mujeres para enarbolar banderas de partidos que nunca han apoyado nuestras causas. Pareciera que para ganar votos, los grupos más reaccionarios y conservadores se quieren poner la camiseta del feminismo. A todos ellos les respondemos: dejen de mentir. Sabemos perfectamente que nuestra lucha les es totalmente ajena. La derecha conservadora y religiosa se opone por completo a nuestra demanda más importante, la despenalización del aborto y el derecho a decidir sobre nuestros cuerpos.
La reproducción de una ideología intolerante y discriminatoria, así como la falta de cuestionamiento sobre los privilegios masculinos y los roles de género, incita el odio hacia las mujeres. Creemos importante recordar que nosotras, feministas socialistas, no luchamos en contra de los hombres, luchamos en contra del sistema capitalista patriarcal. Desde ROSA y Alternativa Socialista México, nos posicionamos contra la estructura del sistema patriarcal que nos oprime a todas y a todos.
Por un feminismo internacionalista con perspectiva de clase.
Por una alternativa socialista para el movimiento feminista contra el patriarcado y el capitalismo.
This was so inspiring. It's so good to hear about the struggles in Latin America. I think it's just so fascinating to hear from the activists in Mexico. I think that the movement there against gender violence and also the conditions that women workers have experienced, really, really interesting to hear about kind of like the way the resistance is working. And I think the struggles that were mentioned are connected to this much, much bigger international movement that's changed the way that young women see the repression. And it's not just the consciousness, it's also the massive struggle that we've seen in the past 10 years. And the new wave of the feminist movement spread around the world with massive struggles for abortion rights and for bodily autonomy in Latin America, but also in Poland. And we've also seen a new spread of the Me Too movement. And young women and LGBTQ plus people have been at the forefront of the recent mass movements generally around the world, including in Belarus, in Russia, in Thailand. So I'm really happy to discuss this. We have got Becky from the ISA in England, Wales and Scotland. Hi, Becky.
Hey, Ara.
And we're going to talk about the Me Too movement and how we can get organised to fight back. So, first of all, Becky, it's great to have you back on the show.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
So I want to ask you, first of all, quite a general question. So can you tell us a little bit more about this new wave of the Me Too movement? And kind of like, because we keep talking about how international it is, so can you tell us a little bit more about the character of this movement and how it became so internationalist?
Yeah, I think that in a way, Me Too never really went away. It's been something that's been constant. The revelations that have come out about sexual harassment and assault and rape coming out all the time against people in the establishment. And obviously it started mainly in Hollywood, but it spanned all areas. So in the US, it's constant. The latest is mainly in politics with a Democrat governor, Andrew Cuomo, who's been accused so far by 3 women. There's political figures in Australia where government ministers have been accused of rape. In India, where the first woman who started Me Too in India, she got accused of defamation, has just been acquitted in court. And in Pakistan, there's women that are facing defamation charges for speaking out against sexual assault against powerful people in the establishment. But as you say, we're also seeing new waves of protests as well, like not just people speaking out, but people protesting as well. So in France, there's been protests in the last year, mainly focusing on child abuse and incest. And that was sparked after a case of a 13-year-old girl where she was repeatedly gang raped by 20 adult men. And it's estimated that 1 in 10 people in France have been victims of child abuse. But also the protests have been aimed at the government because there's a minister in Macron's cabinet that's currently under investigation for rape. In Greece, there's been protests as well. There was an accusation in sport in the Olympic team, the Olympic sailing team, but then that spread across all different areas, and the government's now been forced to make changes to the law, which obviously don't go far enough, but it shows the effect that these protests are having. But also, like, the international character of it, you can see that it's now spreading to new areas where it didn't reach in previous years. Importantly, there's the Balkans, where a small group of women sparked the kind of equivalent of Me Too, which was I didn't ask for it. And that started with them calling out sexual abuse by their acting teacher in Serbia. But then within one day, 4,000 women had spoken out online against all over the Balkans against sexual abuse. And there's also been protests in Iran, in Egypt, in China, and in Turkey. And so it's quite shocking that in pretty much every country or region in the world, there's been protests or mass outrage against sexual harassment. But I think that for us, it's not really surprising, because the capitalist system is based on unequal power relations and control of women's bodies and objectification. And so the reason that it's so widespread and that this movement is so international is because capitalism is so widespread. And I think that all of the things that happen under capitalism to make women feel ashamed of sexual abuse and victim blaming and things like that can mean that people don't come out, they don't speak out until they get given confidence by other people. And then you get this kind of snowball effect where loads of people start taking a stand.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is really important. And I think we've seen this dynamic with the Me Too movement quite a lot. And around the world, it's like you said, it's a lot of times it's kind of like someone with a high profile or like a celebrity that brings attention to the issue, and then it just spirals down and people start talking about those issues in a much more serious way. And I think it has an amazing effect at like changing the consciousness of women around the world. And I think recently there's been in the headlines all the time about Britney Spears. There was the Free Britney movement that's been going on for a few months, if not a year. And obviously recently there was the Framing Britney Spears documentary that kind of follows her life and also follows the legal aspect of her dad completely controlling her life, which is absolutely disgusting. And I think it does a great job at showing all of those details that I think a lot of people, at least online, have seen and known about Britney Spears. But it kind of takes that and exposes the brutal sexism and also the mass sexualization that Britney Spears has gone through. But not just Britney Spears. It shows how kind of the media and paparazzi culture that was really prevalent at the time and is not less prevalent now, is just kind of taking those young women and imprinting upon them those kind of hypocritical views the society has about women and kind of objectifies them. And Britney is very clearly been objectified throughout her life, including as an actual child, like a 10-year-old. And this isn't an isolated incident. It's not just Britney Spears, and it's not just famous teen stars. It's a sexist culture that capitalism fosters and does it through commodification of women's appearance and their bodies as well, but also taking sexuality as something that the industry and the economy benefits from, rather than something that should be for the individual, from an individual choice or pleasure. And I think also it kind of shows the massive amounts of prejudice that are put on women when it comes to our sexuality. And I think this promotes a completely dehumanized view of women. And obviously that really contributes to sexism, and it feeds off of sexism as well. And I think there's something that women experience on a daily basis. And the Me Too movement has really pushed that to the front. And it's no wonder why it's back now, because women are saying enough is enough, but they've said that before the pandemic, but with the pandemic it's even clearer how much more women are suffering. And you know, I think we've seen how not just COVID, but also the economic crisis that came with it just intensified both the gender oppression and exploitation, but also the consciousness of women when it comes to that. And I think we've seen loads of information about how that's affected, you know, the high levels of unemployment of women in particular, struggling with childcare, of course, and also dealing with gender violence. That's another pandemic that has to be addressed. And I think that like the conditions of women have been particularly difficult, even when we talk about a pandemic that doesn't necessarily hit women in a health way more than it does men. And that kind of took that anger that compounded with women throughout the past few years and pushed it even further. So what was the situation been like for women during these crises? And what do you think it means for women, and I think particularly young women's futures?
Well, you mentioned violence against women, which is increased in every country during the coronavirus pandemic. And that's been obviously where there's been lockdowns, like lengthy lockdowns, where particularly women are stuck at home with their abuser, or in many cases domestic violence has started during the lockdown because that kind of isolation and all the stress and things like that has contributed to it. But also you're seeing an increase in sexual harassment at work. Because people, with all of the uncertainty about whether people can keep their jobs and so on, people feel too scared to challenge sexual harassment. And I was reading as well something that's quite shocking, that there's been an increase in cyber sexual harassment because more people are working online, working from home. And there's been like reported increases in like stalking and you know, people receiving threats and so on online, and obviously a massive effect on people's mental health as well. And like mental health was like such a big crisis for young people anyway, because of the way that society is and was before the pandemic, but that's got even worse. But I think like the job losses and how they're mainly affecting women, and it's either that those jobs are being lost, like in the retail sector and hospitality sector and so on, or women are unable to go back to work because they have caring responsibilities as a result of coronavirus. And so, for example, in the US, in September alone, 865,000 women dropped out of the labour force completely. And that was compared to 200,000 men, which is still a big number, but you can see how it disproportionately affects women. But the question about this is like not just how it's affecting women now, but what that will mean in terms of a long-term setback for women. And so even the UN has said that the coronavirus pandemic could wipe out 25 years of increasing gender equality. And so we're seeing that with more unpaid work, women doing more in the home, being pushed back into the home. And I think that will be a question of like, how do we fight back against that? It's not just a question of, for younger women, you know, facing poverty and lack of like job opportunities and so on, but a pushing back of the position of women within society. And obviously we've never been free from oppression, but the gains that were made in the past are under threat now. And I think a lot of young women will be kind of thinking like, really, do we have to fight for all of this again? And we'll be like, you know, questioning kind of what capitalism has to offer for women.
I think what you're saying is really, really important. And I think I completely agree that so many women are now pushed to find solutions. In the past 10 years, we've seen so much of that consciousness change. We've seen women not allowing for those like old creepy men to dictate what we're doing anymore. And I think now with the pandemic, with this unbearable situation on everyone, and I think also with consciousness generally about the government and about the state and how it kind of adds to that sexism and oppression that women experience, I think now women are actually looking for a solution, and a solution that will solve it in the long term, not just, but like, even though there's obviously a major victory that the Me Too movement had, but not just locking up the perverts from the past, but completely preventing that from happening again and again and again now. So I think the main question that we need to ask ourselves now is, what is actually needed? What is the solution? So what do you think the solution is for working class women, and what is the International Socialist Alternative putting forward as the solution?
Well, basically, we need socialist feminism. And I think that like socialism is becoming clearer to people more and more, but also the need for us to fight on things that affect women specifically as well is becoming more and more obvious. So I think in terms of like socialism, we need a socialist healthcare system. I mean, that's clear to everybody because of this pandemic. But mainly women working in the healthcare system are being affected by privatization, not getting a pay rise, and, you know, working in unsafe conditions, but also as service users, like many countries where privatization exists in the healthcare system, women suffer with their health as well. And so what we call for and what we fight for is publicly owned healthcare system that's fully funded, but also that it's democratically controlled by workers and service users, rather than leaving it in the hands of governments who are only, you know, concerned with profit and not providing a proper service. But also, I think it's revealed what kind of education system we need. Obviously, women have been the hardest hit by schools being closed and having to look after children, and that raises lots of questions about, you know, we need free childcare, but also we need free education and, you know, safe working conditions in schools as well. Related to domestic violence, like there's been some governments that have had to step in and increase funding a little bit during the pandemic to deal with the increase in domestic violence. But for the previous decades, these services were being cut back to the bone. And so we don't want just more funding into services, but dealing with, the class questions that are raised around domestic violence, about being able to get out of violent relationships, being able to afford somewhere to live, having a job that pays enough for you to survive by yourself, and so on, as well as funding shelters for people fleeing violent relationships. But also it's dealing with the system that perpetuates these ideas, like Yara was saying before, about why are there so many powerful people that abuse women, that carry out sexual abuse? It's because of ideas about women under capitalism. So we don't want just more money and better services, but also sex and relationship education that talks about consent and talks about what proper relationships should be like, control over the justice system, democratic control, so we're not relying on bigoted judges to make decisions about whether to convict rapists, and so on. And so I think just generally it's shown, the pandemic has exposed capitalism in so many ways, not just in terms of like healthcare and jobs and so on, but also in terms of the ideology of capitalism. And we challenge that with the ideology of socialism. And we would say to women that are trying to fight for all of these things, that to be able to pay for these services and to be able to change change the system, we also need to fight for nationalisation of like the finance industry, of the commanding heights of the economy, the big companies, and carry out international planning so that working class women and workers of all genders can have control over their lives.
Yeah, I think this is really important. I think you really highlighted as well why we keep insisting to put that socialist before feminist. Like we always say that it's not, I think it goes both ways, of course. And I think we talked about it a little bit in the previous episode, that it's not just about, how there's no feminism for real without socialism. There's also no socialism without feminism, because we have to kind of break from this oppression of women in order to create a society that's actually socialist. And we can't have a society that breaks out from this oppression completely without kind of, having a socialist system that will replace those bad ideas and the ideology that stands behind the capitalist system, that stands to exploit us and oppress us because it benefits from it. And I think we talked a little bit about this like earlier in the episode with Marty, about how it's not just that women have been hard hit by this crisis, but they're also at the front line of it. And I think, like we said constantly, it's about finding the solution. And if we can see that the solution is socialist feminism, I think a lot of people would say that, this is a utopia. This is not something we can actually get to. So what can we actually do to break with oppression? What are the steps that are needed in order to create this future that we want to, that is liberation for women, for LGBTQ plus people, and so on?
Well, I think the short answer is that we need mass struggle. And I think the question about it being utopian, I think, we can look at where mass struggle has already taken place. And that isn't because socialists are saying, hey, you should do this. It's because women and other workers are fighting back anyway, because they feel the need to. And so we saw in 2019 that was a year of women's struggle. And obviously 2020 cut across that to an extent, but with coronavirus. But there's been a lot still happening. We've seen a victory just in January this year in Argentina, where mass struggle won abortion rights there. We're seeing mass struggle in Poland against attacks on abortion rights. We've been talking about the Me Too movement, which, isn't a mass movement in the sense that there's like millions of people on the streets all the time. But even just that, mood online has already won victories because of the kind of crisis within society. And I think that this year and next year we'll see that continuing and coming back to the fore on a bigger scale, because I think that anger is not going away or getting better. It's the opposite. Anger is deepening. And so I think that, I kind of said earlier about the increase in unemployment amongst women. Like, what does that mean for working class women being able to fight back? And obviously we would, need struggle to save jobs, strike action to save jobs and to stop pay cuts and those kinds of things. But I think that there will be kind of this feeling of enough is enough, because it isn't just the last year, it's the last 10 years that people have gone through of austerity and an increase in sexism and so on. And I think that there will be a refusal to just accept the situation. And we saw kind of last year, just before many of the lockdowns started on International Women's Day, there were big protests, huge protests, massive strikes, for example, in Mexico. And I think that we need to continue these movements. I think this International Women's Day, it's going to be harder because of coronavirus. But I think that in general, the kind of direction is that we're re-establishing the militant traditions of International Women's Day. But as we've kind of been discussing, we can't just fight against sexism. We have to say that we don't want to return to normal health workers and other workers are already winning concessions when they take strike action or they protest against pay cuts or for pay rises. And I think this shows that we need to make sure that the different movements link up with each other. So the Me Too movement and the women's strikes link up with other workers. They get organised. We've seen women, we've seen examples of this actually, like in Thailand and in Belarus, where women have been at the forefront of those struggles and they've been fighting on their kind of specific demands, but we've seen how they've kind of merged into the other economic and social demands of the movement. And this is kind of like the basis for building a united movement. And I think that coronavirus and the kind of types of struggles that people are in now is raising more and more the need for workers' control and socialist methods of struggle. And I think that this is something that will kind of develop anyway. But obviously, as socialists, we'll get involved in these types of struggles and make these arguments and kind of argue for socialist feminism and try and build, we don't say to women, ignore your problems and just fight on these issues. But we make the point that we can only fight on everybody's issues if we build a united movement of the whole of the working class and oppressed. And that needs to be a movement for international socialism. So, that's a big task, but that's, unfortunately what is necessary. And that's what we're kind of setting ourselves to do.
I think this is kind of like something that keeps on coming up, how every time we go into a feminist protest, it's not just about, it's about connecting the points of what women and women workers need together with the workers' movement, as well as connecting the points that workers need into the women's movement. And I think that is really important. I think, like you said, this is a struggle that's like this new wave of feminist struggle has been going on for about 10 years now. And I think a lot of the kind of activists and feminists that have been involved in this struggle for the past 10 years sometimes can get a little, wary, I guess, feeling like nothing's ever changing. But in the last 10 years, so much has changed. And we can see how these mass movements actually change things. And I think that next step that we're talking about, that the mass movements can take forward, can happen. And, only 2 days ago, it was the birthday of one of the most well-known socialist feminists, Rosa Luxemburg. And she has this really famous saying that weeks before a revolution, everyone says it's impossible. And weeks after a revolution, everyone says it was inevitable. And I think that is something that is really important to remember every time we talk about things like that, because it does sometimes, especially to people who have been active in those struggles for a long time, seem like it's never going to happen. But it always does, until it happens. So thank you so much, Becky. I think this is a lot of food for thought, and I also think that it's not just food for thought, it's food for action. I think a lot of people are can't wait to go back on the streets and fight and struggle for these things when the pandemic gets to a point where it allows us to do that. And in the meantime, there's so much to do, which we're going to talk about in a bit. So thank you so much, Becky, and great to have you again on the show. So now we're going to the best bit of every episode, the shout out of the week. And I think you can guess who we're shouting out this week. So we want to give a big shout out to all of the ROSA activists and socialist feminists around the world who are taking action this weekend and also tomorrow for International Women's Day. And I think it's so amazing to see how, despite the limitations that COVID put upon us, and also the lockdowns, all the restrictions that are going on around the world, we're still seeing this important day of struggle being put to action, and it's really incredible. And I specifically want to mention one place, because ISA supporters in Russia were arrested and fined last week for distributing leaflets for a 2-hour women's strike on March the 5th. And, they've just been preparing to hand out leaflets at the Moscow State University, and they were calling for support for this women's strike. And they didn't even start leafleting yet before the police turned up and arrested them. And I think everyone here wants to send solidarity, and please put your solidarity in the comments as well. It's really important to see how strong we are as an international movement. So we want to send solidarity to specifically ISA supporter Matvey, who was sentenced to 25 days in prison for distributing leaflets, not even going to distribute leaflets. And the crime, according to the judge, was participation in an unsanctioned mass activity. So we obviously can't let that slide. So we have set a fund up. The ISA has set a fund to help any fines that he might have and support the important work that our supporters in Russia are doing. So please check out the link in the description box. Really important. Anything you can donate would be really, really helpful. And there's really horrible environment for activists generally, and especially socialist and feminist activists. And I think it's really, I want to just finish talking about this by making this the same point that has been throughout this episode, kind of weaved throughout this episode, that working class women have been at the forefront of mass movements across the world. We've been fighting against gender oppression, but also against this whole rotten, exploitative, unfair, oppressive system, the capitalist system. So if you heard this and you're not yet a member of International Socialist Alternative, we are not just doing this. We are also on the streets fighting, like we've seen today and like we see all the time. So please, first of all, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the bell button to be notified when we go live and when we upload new videos. But also, please join us. We can do so much more if more people who are as dedicated to fighting the capitalist system and fighting for socialism, if as many of you join us and fight together with us. So we are available all around the world, on every continent, in over 30 countries. So just make sure to send us your details and someone in your area will contact you. That's it from us, and we will see you next week, same time, same place. Bye-bye.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!